going to discuss the subject of probably one of the most mysterious subjects. If we take a look at different groups at various stages associated with the Jewish people, and people that almost ceased to exist and then yet been reborn recently. These are Samaritans. And who are the Samaritans? How much we know about them? For the most part, people know about Samaritans due to the famous parable in the New Testament about the Good Samaritan. And that's how people know about Samaritans. So in America, you have all those hospitals called Good Samaritan. So the parable was there in the New Testament, main book of Christianity, but these were the real people. And by the way, as people quote the story, very often they don't understand the context. Very rarely, those who quote the story of Good Samaritan really understand the initial context of the story. So we'll try to get there. Of course, we're going to take a look at our sources from the Tanakh. We're definitely going to look at some different ways of perceiving what is the identity of Samaritans, because the way we Jews understand the identity and the way the Samaritans themselves tell the story are very different. And we'll try to take a look at the controversy. I specifically studied this also from a Samaritan point of view. I went online to do some extensive research. You don't really have that much information about it from Samaritan point of view. For the most part, because Christians, of course, adopted the traditional narrative of the Jews, the traditional rabbinical narrative is famous. The Samaritan narrative is not that much known. We try to take a look at what's going on. Recent fascination with Samaritans has to do with them being probably the only group known till today that brings the Paschal offering sacrifice. They do it in their traditional sacred place, the Mount Gerizim. Mount Gerizim, of course, been mentioned in the Torah. I'm going to show you some images. That's been taken as recent as last year. And since the calendar, they follow a very similar calendar to the Jewish calendar without the adjustments made by the rabbis. Because we have a permanent calendar. They don't follow the permanent calendar, they follow the new moon every single time, and they follow the cycle without adjusting the calendar. Without getting into details, it's always a few days off. So if you're Shabbat observant and holiday observant, you can still travel there. And many groups will go there to take a look at the how Paschal offering has been brought. Now, that's how they look, these guys. Now, Mount Gerizim, of course, is not the safest area. It's very close to the Palestinian city of Nablus, otherwise known as Shechem. Shechem, of course, is traditionally a Jewish city, mentioned many times in the Torah, mentioned in Tanakh. Their numbers at some point reached a low of less than 200, the beginning of 20th century. Today, they are one of the thriving communities. They basically, 10 years ago, were about 500 of them. Now there's 790. So the numbers are growing to a large degree due to some very, very interesting factor. They had a huge problems with, they don't intermarry. So as you can imagine, they had a huge problem of genetic diseases in their community. And finally, the high priest, which claims to be the descendant of the original high priest of Aaron the Kohen, that's their tradition, that's what they claim, allowed marrying and breeding ladies from Ukraine. And they, of course, undergo some sort of a conversion. That's one of those families you can see here in the picture. This Samaritan is of direct lineage to the high priest. That's his young wife from Ukraine. We start with the peculiar stuff and we get into heavier stuff.
Why from Ukraine though? Why not like from Kazakhstan, for instance?
At this point, I have no answers. Maybe they like the idea that Ukrainian ladies have a strong genetic kind of pool. I'm not sure exactly. Don't ask me that question. I want you to take a look at this.
So wait, before that. So does it
Before
mean
we get into questions, I really want you to take an overall look first, and then we try to. Before we go deeper, I'll take some questions. Okay. So these are the inverted table of ancient alphabets. As you probably know, we have that over here, right? As you probably know, you don't have it? Okay.
it's too few?
Okay, as you probably know, Samaritans are the only people that are still using the script that was used throughout the period of the first temple. We know that the script that we are using today, called Kabashari, so-called Assyrian script, is adopted by us after the destruction of the temple. There's an argument in the Talmud at which script was used when the tablets of the law were received. But generally speaking, when it comes to secular usage throughout the first temple period, we know in many documents that an ancient Hebrew script was used, which is quite distinctively different from the one we're using today. You have the ancient Hebrew here, and you have, of course, the Hebrew is here, right, on the left side. You have the ancient Hebrew script. You can compare it to the ancient Greek script, which was also right to left. You understand the ancient Hebrew script, of course, was the most ancient alphabet from which all scripts derived, including the ancient Greek. But if you compare it with a Samaritan, Samaritan indeed is very similar to ancient Hebrew. We're not getting right now into the details, but Samaritan script is very, very similar, and they have their own version of the Torah. Their version of the text is different to ours. Differences are significant. There are about 6,000 of them. Their text has multiple references, and that's one of the most important breaking points between our tradition, what we call today Judaism, and Samaritan religion. At this point, we're not trying to identify what this is. Is it a form of Judaism? Is it a different religion? We'll go into their ancestry, into their own story, into how we perceive them. But this is the text. You can take a look. Right, that's how it looks. The Samaritan Bible. The Samaritan Torah, as a matter of fact, because they only have 5 books of Moses. They don't believe in any other books. They don't believe in any prophets, in any other books in the scripture. They only have 5 books of Moses. That's all they have. And this is the village where they all moved. They used to live in Nablus, Shechem, as I said, up until the peace agreement came. Before the peace agreement, they had no issues. We get into modern day Israeli politics now. But modern day Israeli politics affected them as well. They were the group that basically became a buffer group between the Jews and the Arabs. They used to live in their own quarter in Nablus. In 90s, as you know, after the peace agreement been signed, there were all major issues with Palestinian autonomy, with all sorts of block posts where soldiers would check your identity and this and that. Samaritans overall will maintain Israeli citizenship, and they will be the only group exclusively traveling freely between the Arabs and the Jews anywhere in the country, without any refrains. Arafat will be friendly with them. Arafat at some point would give the high priest a new car. But then some uglier things happened. Some of the Arabs in Nablus thought that Samaritan actually is an Israeli Jew, and they shoot him. He barely made it to the block post where Israeli soldiers finished him off, thinking of him being a terrorist. That's one of the stories, you know. But this is the village of Luza where they all moved from Nablus. So Nablus now only has a small museum of Samaritan heritage, and adjacent village is also an American village. As you can see, it has 3 languages here. It says the Good Samaritan Center. You have English, you have traditional Hebrew, nowadays Hebrew, right? And on top you have the Samaritan, right? You see the Samaritan on top? You see the Samaritan, right? Right there's on top.
But they also have a community in Holon.
And they have a pretty big community in Holon nowadays. More than 400 people live in Holon. That started in the 50s with Yitzhak Ben Tzvi being very much involved. And others were Israeli leaders shown quite a lot of interest in their heritage, and they were given a plot of land where they developed their own community. This is one of the high priests from late 19th century, one of the first pictures of early leadership of Samaritan community. They got to a point of almost total extinction. Under the British mandate, it started growing, and here is pictured with a book sacred for the community, which we don't have in the Tanakh, but that's one of their books. This is not the Torah. One of the books that they have. So, Samaritans are indeed very, very interesting. They're the only ones to maintain the original script. They're the only ones to still have the Paschal offering, and yet, based on our understanding, based on the traditional Judaism's understanding, they're not exactly Jews. And we're going to get to that point.
Is there a mountain in Israel or in the
Now, this Mount Gerizim
Palestinian?
is a mountain very close to Shechem. Nowadays, it's Palestinian Authority. It has a national park over there, which is operated by Israel, of course. And their village, generally speaking, is considered to be very safe. Samaritans are indeed welcoming people, they're nice people. They, according to their own testimony, what they try to do these days, they try to be the buffer, they try to create some sort of a bridge between the Jews and the Arabs. That happens to some degree, to some extent, because overall they are on good terms with everyone. They try to stay away from politics. They're not involved in anything has to do with modern Israeli politics, and they speak very good Hebrew. Between themselves, they converse in Arabic, and they all study the original Samaritan script. They all study their version of the text of the Torah. Very, very interesting, peculiar. This group used to be very influential and big. This group used to number more than 1.5 million people. This was really a big group. And the rivalry between the Jews and the Samaritans at some point in history got very bitter and ugly. That's why I call this lecture Samaritans, the good, the bad, and the ugly. And as we get to explore the story of Samaritans, by the way, be fully and entirely objective, obviously I'm representing the rabbinical tradition of the sages. At the same time, I do try to take a look at their version of the story. And why is it interesting? Besides all the peculiarities, besides the historical background, these are the real people who live here today. And they actually claim to be the descendants of the 10 tribes. And if there's any other group that makes a claim that can be substantiated in some ways, I would say they're number one. They are number one. We try to take a look and see how substantial their claim is, and we try to take a look and understand certain aspects of Jewish history that otherwise are not known to us. Because Samaritan history is very much part of the Jewish history. It's very much part of the Jewish history. And whether we treat them halachically as Jews or not, and we understand that modern day rabbinical Judaism definitely doesn't treat them halachically as Jews, and we're going to take a look at some references in the Talmud, and there are numerous, which is actually very, very interesting. Modern genetic studies suggest that truth is always somewhere in between, right? That they do have a significant Jewish gene present there. So to some degree their claim is also substantiated by modern day genetic studies, that they represent a group of a direct lineage of what they call themselves Bnei Israel, the Israelites. Not the Jews, not the descendants of the tribe of Judah, but Israelites, the descendants of the lost tribes of Menashe and Ephraim, the tribal lineage of Yosef, of Joseph. Because we take a look at the map, I haven't brought the map, there's enough stuff in here, right? Pretty much fills the table. If you take a look at the map of ancient Israel, you're going to have, and nowadays, those who are familiar with the geography of Israel today, Shomron, again, is on the map. Shomron, if you go, you hit the road north of Jerusalem. You're going to hit first the tribal land of Benjamin, and right after, Samaria, Shomron, which is historical location of Samaritans. That's Shomron, right? It's really not that far from Jerusalem. You can hit the road in 40 minutes and make it to the Mount Gerizim, which is their sanctuary. They don't believe in Jerusalem being a holy place. For them, the holy place is Mount Gerizim, and that's a major point of controversy, of course. We're going to take a look at how they interpret the Torah and why they come to that conclusion. We're going to take a look at their version of the story, and of course, we're going to take a look at the Jewish version of the story, and we'll try to make sense of it all. Besides all the peculiar, people today are fascinated with all little groups, and that's something very, very attractive to tourists. And indeed, I've never done it before. I really want to go one day and take a look at the Paschal offering ceremony. That always happens on a regular day according to the Jewish calendar. So it must be something fascinating. If anything, it's an attempt almost like you can almost like travel in times and think how it was, right, when we used to have the temple in Jerusalem, where we used to have the sacrifices. Very, very interesting. But aside all the peculiar and interesting character of this historical developments, I think it also has some very, very esoteric and mystical meaning as well. Because we can take a look at the conflict in the family. Remember the biblical account, what it says in the Torah. The conflict between Yosef and the brothers, how Joseph was sold into slavery. And eventually, we take a look at that conflict. Later in our history, it's the split after the death of King Solomon. And the northern tribes, under the guidance of Yerovam, right, who is, of course, Josaphat, right? He's a direct descendant of the tribe of Yosef. They going to split off from what would remain as the base of what we call Judaism today, because the northern tribes eventually go into exile. Samaritans possibly preserve this missing link to unlock the mystery of the lost tribes, and possibly it also gives us an idea of what kind of Judaism, which was very much criticized eventually by the rabbis, initially by the prophets, what kind of Judaism was practiced in the Northern Kingdom. Because really, if we take a look at the story in the Northern Kingdom, as it's recorded in Tanakh, we're not going to find one king that was righteous there. They all at some point were into idolatry. And that's how they disappeared. And then Samaritans come out of nowhere. Where do they come from exactly? What happened? So first of all, let's take a look at source number 1 in the quotes at the Book of Kings. Sefer Melachim, of course, is part of the Tanakh. It's part of our 24 books that we believe to be holy. And there we have a historical account of what happened right after the tribes were sent. That's what we spoke about last time. The tribes were sent into exile by the Assyrians. First Tiglath-Pileser, then eventually Shalmaneser, and Sargon. At that time, we're talking about 722, 723 BC. It's the 8th century before Common Era, right? 2000, almost 2,800 years ago. Right? What happens next? Let's take a look at source number 1. The king of Assyria brought people from Babylonia and from Kuta. Kuta is significant here because in the Talmud, Samaritans will be known as Kutim, the people of Kuta. In other words, in rabbinical Judaism, they are an example of non-Jews. They are someone who came from elsewhere. They came from Kuta. Not exactly non-Jews, though, because as we're going to see, they will adopt much of Judaism. And other places been mentioned here, Avan, Hamat, and Svarvaim. We don't know exactly where this place is. Some of them we don't, some of them we do. We know Kuta was a big center in Babylonia. This place has been mentioned in archives and elsewhere. And he settled them in the cities of Samaria instead of the children of Israel. And they took possession of Samaria and dwelt in its cities. So it seems like basically it's an exchange of population. Like Stalin would do, like many others throughout history, right? You want to make sure that nations don't rebel against you. Those nations are subdued by you. So what do? You exchange the population. If they're going to be in a foreign land, then they're going to rebel. They're going to feel very uncomfortable. And this way you secure your borders and you make sure that all these people remain subservient to you, to your rule. Right? They're all dependent on you now. And that's what he does. And it was the beginning of that dwelling there that they did not fear the Lord. And Hashem incited lions against them, and they were killing them. Interesting, peculiar fact from early days from. And we know stories with lions. Remember Samson, right? We know lions were part of the fauna of the land of Israel those days, right? So now they said to the king of Assyria, the nations that exiled and settled in the city of Samaria do not of the land. And he has incited lions against them. And behold, they're killing them, as they do not know the law of God and the land. That was the understanding of those days, right? Something's going wrong. You attribute it to whom? To the master of the land. Right? Who's in charge of the land? Well, Jews have their own God. Must be the Jewish God is upset at the newcomers, right? And he sends lions. We need to resolve this issue. It's not working well. Right? And the king of Assyria commanded, saying, bring there one of the priests, whom I have exiled from there, and let them go and dwell there, and teach them the law of God of the land. Very cool, it says. Fine, we have those remnants of the 10 lost tribes. Don't forget that in the land of the 10 tribes, we also have some Levites and some Kornites. So some of the Kohen is going to be sent back to teach those colonists, those newcomers, to teach them the Jewish law. Right? It's interesting, it's coming as a commander of the king of Assyria. You know, so it's common understanding that at least in that land you need to observe the law of the land, which is Judaism. And one had exiled from Samaria came and settled in Bethel, and he would direct them how they should fear the Lord. And yet you see that it wasn't exactly all of a sudden there was a change of heart and they just decided to observe Judaism purely. That's not exactly what happens here. Because it says each nation made its God. They placed it in the temple of the high places the people of Samaria had made, in the cities wherein they were dwelling. And it brings the names of those gods. These are pagan gods, of course. In other words, they decided to adopt some sort of a syncretism. They said, okay, now possibly they just decided to create some sort of a syncretic religion. Not very clear from this account in the book of Kings, but, well, but then it says again, verse 32, and they feared the Lord, and they made some of them priests of the high places, who practiced their rites in the temple of the high places. They feared the Lord, yet they worshipped their own gods, as was the custom of the nations whom they had exiled from there. So in other words, we have an interesting picture here. We have some people, colonists, coming from Persia and from Babylonia, out of fear of lions, adopting Judaism, and the Talmud would eventually have a dispute. These people, later on known as Samaritans, in the eyes of the rabbis, who are these people? They observe, evidently, many of the laws of Judaism. What is their status? Some of the laws they don't observe, because they would not observe anything that has to do with what we call rabbinical Judaism, what we call oral Torah. They would only abide by the written law. And they would even have their own version of the text. So even the version of the Torah would tell them, for instance, in 10 Commandments. In 10 Commandments would tell them that you need to build the temple on Mount Gerizim. In their version of the 10 Commandments. Their version of the 10 Commandments is different from ours. So who are these people? It's not exactly pagans. It's not exactly the nations, but it's not the Jews either. So who are they? So according to rabbinical understanding, we'll get there later, they have very peculiar status. They're kutim. They are in some ways, they're according to, and they're problematic. Talmud has a dispute about their conversion. Was it a genuine conversion, or was it out of fear of the lions? Based on this text, it seems like the later. But some rabbis would give them the credit and say, no, they're very genuinely, it was initiated by the situation, but eventually they're very genuinely converted to Judaism, and therefore converted. Be what may, look at Paul Johnson, source number 2.
Disconnect, not have a full version.
Okay, Paul Johnson, History of the Jews, of course, one of my historians. One of my favorite historians, Paul Johnson, he was a Christian. And he wrote a very good book of Jewish history, a history of the Jews. Favorite readings. Very, very highly recommended. So he here writes a historical account of what happened. Shalmaneser took Samaria in the winter of 720 to 721 BC. Then the following year, he completed the destruction of the northern kingdom. He removed the entire because based on the account number one, it seems like basically now what happened? All the population of Israelites were like tons of people. Well, now we have the and we are there 27 were taken, and similar to what happened, for instance, in the Baltic countries when the communists came, right? The communists came to Latvia, let's say, to Lithuania, to Estonia. The Bolsheviks, the commissars came there, right? What did they do? They took all the elite. By the way, about the same numbers, also about 20,000, 25,000 Latvians were taken to Siberia, right? Or same number of Lithuanians, but they only took the elite. They didn't care about the rest. And they would bring in, to make sure the right influence, is there, when we'll bring in the commissars, that will bring in some influx of people going to work in the factories to create the right setting, right, to install communism in those countries, right? However, we know for a fact that most of Latvians stayed. It would be naturally to assume that most likely, again, we don't have the evidence, the clear evidence, but it seems from the numbers given, Samaria at that time must have been much more than just 27,000 given here. And therefore, most of the historians believe that probably many Israelites did stay. It's also pretty clear from the later books of the Tanakh. We have an interesting story. Remember the Babylonian exile? Well, this is 722. Babylonian exile starts about 580 BC. 570 BC, the temple has been destroyed, and we are being given traditionally the date of 70 years. There were a few waves of return. The first wave was with Zerubbabel, right? And then eventually it'll be over 100 years, and Ezra and Nehemiah will bring another wave. Now Zerubbabel basically seems to be a secular leader. He didn't really care so much, it seems, about religious observance, at least when Ezra comes 100 years later. He sees the situation where most of the people intermarry. And Ezra makes very clear distinction between what he calls Am Haaretz, the people of the land, and the people who came from Babylonia. He wants to create a separation. It seems like people of the land initially perceive themselves being part of the same nation. Who are these people? Where are they? Well, it's a bit speculative, but arguably, and that's the Samaritan version of the story, these are the Samaritans. Some of them were never exiled, some of them always stayed in the land. Eventually, people will come from Assyria, right? The colonists, and they will intermarry with Samaritans, and they will adopt Judaism, Samaritan version of it must be. But again, we don't know. Is that plausible? Is it possible? I think so.
So in the Babylonian exile, none of those went? Maybe some of them went into Babylonian exile as well?
Samaritans, if they took part in Babylonian exile, Babylonians exiled mainly Judeans, right? Jerusalem. Their campaign was against Judea.
So that's what I'm asking. So
their campaign was not against the northern land, which already was basically conquered.
Okay.
Right? Nothing happened there. So their campaign was specifically against Judea and Jerusalem.
Okay.
So,
but then Am Haaretz.
I want you to take a look at what Johnson says at the very end of page 1 here. And I think that is important. It says, the first great mass tragedy in Jewish history took place is talking about the exile of the 10 tribes. In the eyes of Jerusalem and its priests, the northerners had always mingled with the pagans. If you take a look at the Tanakh stories about the northern kingdom, they're all bad. Not a single good story, all bad stories. They constantly worship idols, avodah zarah, all that stuff, all the time. So the following dispersal of the northern kingdom and intermarriage of the remnant with the aliens was used to deny Samaritans their original Israelite heritage. So he claims eventually this would be sealing their faith, as to begin with there was some sort of a discontent, was this very strong disagreement. The Judaism practiced in the north wasn't the Judaism practiced in Jerusalem. And eventually what would happen with Ezra returning and very firmly insisting that all should return their foreign wives and bring them back where they came from. We don't know exactly whether this was implemented or not. To a large degree, since it was, at least for the time being. But he came with a very strong understanding that Judaism needs to be observed fully. And some people probably followed him. Well, we understand eventually, about 100 years after these events, during the reign of Alexander, Samaritans will be given the right to build their own temple on Mount Gerizim. And they're going to build the temple, and the temple is going to be there for about 200 years, eventually destroyed by
Romans.
the Jews.
All right.
Jews will destroy the
It is
temple. That's
something.
Hasmoneans. In other words, at that point, we already have a very strong rivalry between the Samaritans and the Jews. And Hasmoneans will destroy that temple. The temple will exist about 200 years only. And then we have the stories of the first century stories that would make it into the New Testament, for instance. And then we have the observations made by the rabbis of about the same period, maybe 100 or 200 years later, in the Mishnah, in the Talmud, about Samaritans. We'll take a look at it later, yes.
Before we go there,
Yeah.
so the term Am Haaretz, does it refer to the people of the 12 lands or 2 lands?
Oh, that's a good question. First of all, the term Am Haaretz, it seems to be the way it was applied in the Tanakh, was not necessarily a negative term. It just means people of the land.
Right.
We know in Talmud, Am Haaretz means ignoramuses, people who know nothing. You can't sit at the same table with them and eat food from them because it's not trustworthy that they even observe Shabbat Kashrut.
Okay.
You can't. So rabbis would look a bit down at Am Haaretz. Am Haaretz are people who are somewhat despised, and it seems to be coming in the book of Ezra. We already have that type of attitude where Am Haaretz are the people who don't know much about the law. They intermarry.
Well, it's those who stayed behind, right? Essentially,
These
and
are the
lost their
ones-
ways.
It appears,
But-
it appears, even in the book of Ezra, there were
Right.
two groups.
Question.
Not clear. Not very clear.
Mhm.
Not very clear. But at this point, in the Second Temple period, and we have first the temple of the Samaritans being destroyed, and then we have a rivalry. And throughout the wars that Jews will have with the Romans, Samaritans will side with the Romans. And they also have a few rebellions against the Byzantines, and that's how they will eventually get decimated. We'll have 3 of those rebellions, and Byzantines at that time already, Byzantines, these are Romans who became Christians. Right, in 325 CE, Roman Empire becomes Christian, and the Byzantines, that's how we know Romans who became Christian, right? They will try to convert them. They will try to build the church over there on Mount Gerizim, and the church will be destroyed by the Samaritans. Will butcher them and rebel against them. And there will be 3 major rebellions. Probably all that we had. Similar to the Great Revolt and the Bar Kokhba Rebellion, but we had 2 major ones, they had 3. And that's how they got totally decimated. And so that's a very interesting example. That's possibly also shed some light to how rabbis were so much against any further rebellions against the Romans. And earlier than Samaritans, but we can learn from Samaritans that apparently that's how they dwindled. To the point where they became almost non-existent in history. They were a very, very significant large group of population. How do I know that? That will take a look at a few stories now to see how significant they were and what kind of rivalry we're having here. First, I want to take a look at source number 5. Then we'll get to the New Testament. Source number 5 is Josephus, right? Josephus Flavius. In the book 20 of the Antiquities. He brings us a very interesting story that sheds the light to how things were at the time. Just to give you a little bit of geography, we have Galilee. That's the geography of Israel today. We have Galilee, then we have Shomron, Samaria, and then we have Jerusalem. So if you want to travel the shortest road from Galilee, where's Galilee? Tzfat is in the Galilee, right? You want to travel on the road there to Jerusalem, what would be the shortest road? It would be through so-called today occupied territories, through so-called, that's where Samaria is, right?
90 or something?
That will be the shortest road, right? If you imagine the map of Israel. And that's exactly the road that people will take from Galilee to Jerusalem. Was it the safest? And it wasn't. Samaria and Samaritans were not necessarily friendly to Jews. They were quite hostile. And so here's the story in Josephus. It was the custom of the Galileans when they came to Holy City at the festivals, to Jerusalem, right? To take their journeys through the country of Samaritans. On their route lay a village called Ginean, which was situated on the border between Samaria and the Great Plain. At this time, certain persons fought with the Galileans. Many of them. The leaders of the Galileans were informed of what had been done. They came to Cumanus. Who's Cumanus? He's the Roman procurator. You understand, we're talking about a period of time that's first century. Before the destruction of the temple, that's the time when Flavius is recording those events, right? So that's the time when Romans are ruling the land. So they complained to Cumanus, about what happened. But Cumanus was bribed by the Samaritans to do nothing. They paid him money, gave him some shochad, So he would do nothing about it. And Jews were very upset. The Galileans, indignant at this, urged the Jewish populace to resort to arms and to regain their liberty, saying that while slavery was a bitter thing, but that when it was joined with direct injuries, it was completely intolerable. In other words, they decided to attack back. They decided to retaliate, take revenge of the Samaritans. They entreated the assistance of Elazar, son of Dineas. Now, who is this man? This man is a known robber. This man is a bandit. And Mishnah describes him such. So they, decided to hire their local mafia guy, the Jewish mafia guy, basically, right, to take care of the Samaritans. A robber who had for many years made his home in the mountains. And with his assistance, they set afire and plundered many villages of Samaritans. Right? So what's happening? In small letters here, we have some explanation to the story. So Galileans setting fire Samaritan villages as a revenge. And here, take a look, we have a quote from the Mishnah. Mishnah will be recorded about 100 or more years later after the story. And in the Mishnah, Sotah, tractate Sotah, it says, when Elazar, son of Dinai, came, they changed his name to, he wasn't a particularly nice guy. Right? They named this guy son of a murderer. Wasn't a particularly nice character. But, they had to fight back, and that's what they did. Now he also says here, a particular incident recorded here was extremely bad. It resulted in Cumanus being dismissed because they sent the embassy, probably both sides most likely, sent the embassy to Rome. Cumanus was dismissed and sent a new procurator, and he took care of not the Samaritans, he took care of this robber. He took care of Lazar, son of Dinah, and he killed him. He was eventually sent to Rome and was executed as a bandit. But we see that things were quite hot at the time, right? Between the Jews and the Samaritans. They clearly don't like each other. At this point, clearly don't like each other. Keeping that in mind, we need to take a look at the story in the New Testament. The famous story that is in the Gospel. One of the key stories in Christianity, the story of a Good Samaritan. The full version of the story, or the more complete version of it, appears in the Gospel of Luke. We're going to take a look at the Gospel of Luke chapter 10. That's source number 3. On one occasion, an expert in the law stood up to test Jesus. Who's an expert in the law? You understand this is a Prushi, a Pharisee, right? It's a Jew that is well versed in Halakha, in the Jewish law. And he wants to see how much Jesus knows the Jewish law. Teacher, he asked, what must I do to inherit eternal life? That's $1 billion question. Everybody wants to know the answer. Let's see how he responds. In the law, he replied, how do you read it? So he answered, love your Lord God. First, love your Lord, your God, with all your heart, and with all your soul, and with all your strength, and with all your might, and love your neighbor as yourself. Two things it said. Love God, and love your neighbor, right? This is the essence of the law. He's clearly a Pharisee. He understands it's not about some technical things. It's not about service in the temple, like the Sadducees would insist. It's about the ethics. And the most important pillars of the law are loving God and loving your neighbor. Very good. Now Jesus, it's somewhat a Socratic man of dialogue, right? He's asking the next question. He said, you answered correctly. Do this and you will live. But that's not the end of it. Now, Pharisee wants to justify himself, so he's asking, who is my neighbor? What does he imply exactly by this? Because we know rabbinical interpretation, your neighbor is a Jew. Your neighbor is somebody who is with you in the law. And we understand that Jesus wants to teach a lesson from this story that somebody who's not treated as equal of yours could also be a good person, could also be a neighbor. And he gives the following parable. A man was going down from Jerusalem to Jericho when he was attacked by robbers. They stripped him of his clothes, beat him, and went away, leaving him half dead. Priest happened to be gone down the same road. We know that road, right? Road that takes you down, very, very sharp descent on the road from Jerusalem to Jericho, right? Before you go down to the Dead Sea. That's the road he hit. So he's going down the road, and when he saw the man, he passed by on the other side. Possibly he's too scared to get involved. Possibly he is a priest that doesn't want to defile himself with a dead body, and maybe he's not confident that the person is alive. Possibly he doesn't want to get bothered. The road is not particularly safe. Robbers were on that road. Whatever the case is, he decides not to get involved. So to a Levite, when he came to the place and saw him, passed by on the other side. Now, they pretend nothing happened. Right? They just passed, they crossed the street, and they continue business as usual. Now comes a Samaritan. As he traveled, came where the man was, and when he saw him, he took pity on him, went to him and bandaged his wounds, poured in oil and wine. Then he put the man on his own donkey, brought him to an inn, and took care of him. The next day he took out 2 denarii and gave them to the innkeeper to look after him, he said. And when I return, I will reimburse you for any extra expense you may have. Which of these 3 do you think was a neighbor to the man who fell into the hands of the robbers? He's asking Jesus. Obviously, we understand the answer obviously is the last one. And the expert in the law replied, the one who had mercy on him. And then Jesus told him, go and do likewise. And this was taken as a practical command. That's how you have all the Good Samaritan charity institutions, Good Samaritan hospitals in the Christian world, right? That is the interpretation of the story. However, the context somehow is lost, because when we read the story today without all the previous information we learned about Samaritans, we don't understand who Samaritans exactly were. Samaritan is a lower strata of society. They are, from Jewish perspective, from traditional Jewish perspective, at this point they are despised. They are not exactly Jews. They are not exactly ours. And the hostility is on both sides. It's not exactly Samaritans are the poor people that are being basically downtrodden by the Jews, because hostilities go on both sides. We can see that Samaritans sometimes attacking the Jews, then Jews retaliate, so it goes both ways. But we can clearly see at this point Samaritan is an example of someone who's an alien. Not only an alien, a hostile person who is not one of ours. Luke in chapter 9, another reference in the New Testament, very similar to what we just read in Josephus. Source number 4. When the days drew near for him to be taken up, he set his face to go to Jerusalem, and he sent messengers ahead of him. On their way, they entered the village of the Samaritans to make ready for him, but they did not receive him. Samaritans don't want to receive him. Why? Because his face was set toward Jerusalem. Why do you think Samaritans are so upset? He's going to a temple in Jerusalem. Samaritans have nothing to do with a temple in Jerusalem. They have a temple on Mount Gerizim, which is already destroyed at this point. And to begin with, they don't like this whole idea of Jerusalem. So they're hostile. They don't want to have him. Not like in a parable that he gave, but this is a real story. Apparently we see, as opposed to the parable where we have good Samaritans, here we have some Samaritans that are not. Right? And yet, when his disciples, James and John, saw this, they said, Lord, do you want us to command fire to come down from heaven and consume them? Let them just destroy like that, just for a miracle and destroy this whole place. But he doesn't want to do that. He turned and rebuked them, and they went on to another village. What we see from this story as well, right? Relationship with the Jews and Samaritans, and we see Jerusalem as a factor. Jerusalem is something holy to the Jews. If you mention them to Samaritans, they get very upset. They don't like it. You go to Jerusalem and nothing with us. Get out of here. We're not going to accept you. So relationships were definitely very hostile at this point. And the source of hostilities is religious. We have two people basically of otherwise very close geographically and close historically, having different interpretation of what's holy and having different version of tradition. And we get to the Talmud, finally get to the Talmud where we have a halachic aspect of it. What is the status of these people from rabbinical perspective, from normative Jewish perspective? How do you relate to people? And don't forget, there were many of them. And as you can see, they acted very independently. They would take sides. When there will be Jewish rebellion against the Romans, in the Great Revolt, some of the Samaritans will open the gates of cities of the Jews to the Romans. Some of them would openly side with the Romans. And that would obviously add to the fire hostilities. Similar stories would happen during the Bar Kokhba revolt. There was a Samaritan that was very close associate to Bar Kokhba. And people told him, don't trust this man. And Bar Kokhba apparently does trust him. And eventually he will be the one to give him over to the Romans. That's the story recorded in Josephus. No, not in Josephus. Josephus would record the story. It's recorded in different sources. Not in Josephus though, but it's recorded. I don't have it here with me. So we understand that these were hostilities going both ways. Now, if you take a look at the Talmud, first sources from Mishnah period must be about 1st century, right? The Tosefta is more or less contemporary of the Mishnah. Mishnah was recorded 220 CE. So here it says, matzah of a Samaritan is kosher. You can eat a matzah of a Samaritan. Samaritan believes in what it says in the Torah. His text is somewhat different from ours, but overall, 95% of the text is the same. So when it comes to the commandments, it says, you observe Passover, you don't eat chametz. Throughout the holiday, you eat matzah. Practical question, can you eat matzah made by a Samaritan? Now see, as there is no concern that it might be leavened, and person fulfills his obligation to eat matzah on the first night. It's a biblical commandment. Don't forget, it's a mitzvah in the Torah to eat matzah on Pesach. Apparently, one fulfills this obligation if he eats a matzah of a Shomrani or Samaritan. Right? Rabbi Eliezer disagrees, and he prohibits this because it says Samaritans are not well versed in details of mitzvot. He doesn't disagree saying that they don't observe it. He says yes, they definitely observe it. But they're not familiar with the details, so we cannot really accept their matzah. They may, without even knowing it, they mix some stuff that's chametz. We cannot trust their level of observance. They're not familiar with the details. The third opinion is, Rabban Shimon ben Gamliel says, on the contrary, what we know about them is that if they observe a mitzvah, they observe it like proselytes usually do, like the newcomers here. They observe it stringent, to such a level of stringency that it's more exact in its observance than even the Jews do. And we know for a fact that they observe matzah. Things they didn't accept, we can't trust them, but things that they did, apparently they're even stricter than Jews themselves. Now comes Talmud Bavli, contracted Kiddushin, and here there's a discussion about why Samaritans are disqualified from marriage. One cannot marry a Samaritan. So there's a whole discussion going on here, and we understand one opinion here is because they are not well versed in the details of mitzvot. I'm not getting the whole discussion here, but apparently, what details of marriage they're not well versed, Talmud is asking, and in response, they're not well versed with regard to laws of betrothal and divorce. And therefore, what will happen is you may have not a kosher get, you may have not a kosher procedure of divorce, and you have mamzering, you have a situation of a mamzer, of a bastard, right? Which is, of course, a huge problem. And therefore, they have the status of mamzerim due to uncertainty as to identity of those who are assimilated there, right? Some mamzerim must have been assimilated there because they never observed the law according to the way we do. That, of course, creates a big issue, right? And that, of course, you understand, seals any possibility of becoming one nation. We have a situation where these people are very close, and Therefore, they create a bigger problem because they do observe some of the mitzvot, but they don't observe. Samaritans say about themselves on 1st of March 1919. Israeli Samaritans numbered 140. That was the lowest point. Only 140 people were basically extinct, right? Like some nations in the northern part of Siberia, right? You have some of them being about the same numbers, and they dwindle, they go down. But that didn't happen to Samaritans, because on January 1st, 2013, they were numbered 756. And numbers are growing. 2 years ago, there was 600 something, now they're almost 800. They grow actually at a pretty good pace. Not only that, there's two locations, Kiryat Luza, close to Nablus, in 399 well in Chalon. And if you compare the numbers of males and females, they had a huge issue with males being significantly bigger in numbers than females. That's not healthy for demographics. Now it's almost 50-50. Survey shows recovery of the Samaritan community is gradual approach to world average 49 males and 51 females. It's happening gradually. They definitely done a very good pace, and you have a very high number of young people in this community, the highest in Israel, and one of the highest in the world. In other words, it's a growing community. It's stabilized. It's not declining anymore. It's growing.
Do they stick to the patrilineal descent?
They do stick, according to their understanding. They have no issue with taking a woman, for instance, from Ukraine, because they will live Samaritan, and the nationality and the descent is patrilineal, as I said here, based on the father, not the mother.
So when you refer to the genetic studies that confirmed, they can only confirm the patrilineal part.
So I'm not sure exactly what they confirm, either some of the genes of the Cornites or some of them. I'm not sure exactly what it is, but I've seen some of them. So you see, it's not in notes because I haven't investigated it significantly. But we're almost done. What I want to finish with is two versions of the story. And here we have the summary of the two versions, Samaritans and their origins. There's 3 pages here. Samaritans and their origins. There's 2 versions of the story of what happened. This is going to be a bit of a summary. So version number 1 is Samaritans were a pagan sect that grew out of the tribes of Menashe and Ephraim after deportation in 723, right, by Shalmaneser, and they were the colonists who came to settle. And as we see in the account in the book of Kings, they adopted some of Judaism and mixed it with some of their pagan cults. After return of Judah, Samaritans ceased to worship idols, but they invented a brand new alternative religion, where they chose Mount Gerizim as the holy mountain, in direct opposition to Jerusalem. Why they are so hostile to Jerusalem? Well, apparently, one of the reasons could be, if you take a look at the ongoing hostility between the tribes that existed for quite some time, you can track it back to the story of Yosef and the brothers. The record wasn't entirely closed, and eventually the 10 tribes would rebel against Rehavam, and in other words, tribes would maintain their own identity, and the northern tribes, under the leadership of Yosef, will maintain somewhat of a different identity and different understanding of what it is being an Israelite and Ben Israel than the southern tribes under Judah would. And that could be one of the factors. Now, this piece is taken from Encyclopedia Britannica. Samaritans call themselves Bnei Israel or Shamerim. Shamerim is like the word Shamer in Hebrew. They're observant ones. What do they observe? Well, they observe the Torah. Interestingly enough, in their version of the 10 Commandments, they're also not allowed to say openly, to recite the name of God. And they call God Shema, the one who can be heard, the one whose name can be only listened to, but we're not pronouncing his name. Like we say Hashem, very similar. In the Talmud, they called Kutim, suggesting that they are descendants of Mesopotamian Kutians, right, from Persia, who settled in Samaria. But that's not what they say about themselves. But take a look at their version of the story. Jews who returned to their homeland after Babylonian exile would not accept the help of the dwellers of the land. We don't discuss that episode. And, this is a very interesting episode in the book of Ezra, where Ezra comes with a second wave back from Babylon. Apparently, the local people, not very clear who these local people are. From later account, it appears the local people are what eventually will be identified as Samaritans. They want to offer some help with building the walls of Jerusalem and with building the temple. And Ezra is not happy about it. He doesn't want their help. And they would eventually write a whole letter, clause. They will write a letter that will cause to stop building the temple for a significant amount of time. The building project will be put on hold. They're going to say the following argument, take a look at the records.
Who wrote?
Who are they again?
No, who wrote the letter?
Who wrote the letter?
Not
It seems that those colonists, their descendants, because they consider themselves somewhat more affiliated with Assyria, right? What's happening there, and they say, take a look at your royal archive, take a look at the records of the city of Jerusalem. It's a rebellious city. If they're going to rebuild it, it's only going to be to your detriment. It's not what put your money. It's not a good idea for you, Persians. Don't do that. This city is not good for you. It's only eventually going to rebel against you. They apparently look in the archives and find, there were quite a number of rebellions. And eventually they put the project on hold. Who are the people who sent the letter? Well, we understand either these were the colonists, or could be these were the people who were there in the land, somehow associated, according to the verses, with Samaritans. Right? So we already have that rivalry here. Right? You don't want to accept us as one of ours. Oh, okay, so then we're not going to let you build this. Right.
like this.
Consequently, in the 4th century BC, Samaritans built their own temple in Nablus, at the base of Mount 25 miles north of Jerusalem. A low esteem Jews had for Samaritans was the background of the famous parable of the Good Samaritan. We discussed that already. Now let's take a look at a Samaritan version of the story. As I said, there's this fascinating site of Israelite Samaritan Institute. I have a link here. Anybody interested, you can find it easily. Just Google it, or I can send you a link afterwards if you want. Their version of the story is like this. After the people of Israel entered the sacred, Joshua put the temple of Moses, containing the tent of the covenant on the summit of Mount Gerizim. Everybody asks the question, what is so special about Mount Gerizim? Well, they're going to tell you, Mount Gerizim is a place mentioned in the Torah. And according to their understanding, this was the place where the tabernacle was standing initially. Not saying that in the text of the Torah that we have. In the text of the Torah we have, Mount Gerizim is the place of the blood. Yes, but it doesn't say that's going to be the place where the tabernacle will be put. But in their version of the text it says so. In book Dvarim, chapter 27, it speaks about a blessing and a curse. The blessing on Mount Gerizim and curse on Mount Ebal, and then it says in our version of the text that on Mount Ebal you should put the 12 stones. And apparently we understand that that's where the tabernacle should be built. But they would ask the following question: if this is the mount on which you proclaim the curses, wouldn't it be more logical to put it in the mount of the blessings? Right? So they want to claim that they have the original version of the text, and really it shouldn't be Mount Ebal. It should be Mount Gerizim. And they have very extensive rendering of our text of the Torah that we have when it comes to Mount Gerizim. Mount Gerizim in their version of the text is very significant. As I said, it appears in the Ten Commandments. In their version of the Ten Commandments, it starts with commandment prohibiting idolatry. They don't have I'm your God, which seems to be an introduction. They don't have that. They go straight to number 2. And then they have an extra commandment of building their tabernacle where? Or the temple of Mount Gerizim. Now, they themselves explain what happened further on. So they want to say like this. They want to say the following: people of Israel worshipped on Mount Gerizim and made offerings at the temple of Moses until 260 years after people of Israel entered the land of Israel. We don't have that record in our books, and naturally, They don't follow all books of the Tanakh. Book of Joshua, Book of Judges, all the books of the Tanakh, they describe this period. There's no record of this. That's how they don't. They're going to say that this text basically being written under the influence from Jerusalem. They're not taking into account our version of the story. So they don't follow any of that. And they claim the dispute occurred within the temple priesthood. Apparently Eli, the priest, who is descendant of Itamar, son of Aaron, rebelled against the high priest. Yeah, we don't have that in our version of the text. It's what they claim. So he rebelled against the high priest Uzi ben Buki, and as a result, he was forced to leave Mount Gerizim and went with his supporters to Shiloh. And Uzi, fearing a religious rift among the people of Israel, then hid the temple of Moses in one of the... that sounds a little bit tricky because you have no historical evidence to any of those claims they make. But that's how they want to trace their lineage all the way back to the beginning and to claim that really Jews are the ones who started the rift. We are the original ones. And they say the temple remains there undiscovered to this day. And that's how they believe the temple will be discovered eventually in the future. They believe in only one prophet, in Moshe. But in the future will come another one. We call this Mashiach. They call that a different way of looking at it. But they believe that eventually a descendant of Yosef, of Joseph, will come and the temple of Mount Gerizim will be rebuilt. And the tribe of Joseph would not submit to the rule of David. And Solomon later on, as we understand, they rebelled against the house of David when Solomon died. And subsequently, the tribe of Joseph led the northern tribes to form the large kingdom of Israel. Relations, as we know, this part we know, all agree on that part, the kingdoms of Israel and Judah were not on good terms. Then Assyria came. And here their account differs from what we have in the book of Kings. Because of the text, and that's the origin of Samaritans, it's the colonists that came from elsewhere, right? But they say no. Assyrians brought a group of administrators to supervise taxation of Israelites, transfer revenue. This foreign minority lived among Israelite majority. Israelite majority continues to observe the law. What about the minority? They agree that there were some instances of pagan worship among the minority, but eventually some of these minority people will be absorbed into mainstream Israelite society, right? They will become Israelites. And some will just return to Assyria. That's the version of the story, right? Now, eventually, there's two waves of return of the exiles from Babylon. And as I mentioned, Ezra comes back with a second wave. And Israelite leaders attempt to coexist peacefully with the returning exiles. That's the Samaritan version of it, right? And they stretch their hand and say, okay, let us help you with this building project of Jerusalem. But apparently Ezra is not interested. And we understand Ezra is not interested because he understands these people are potential danger there. There's a lot of idol worship in there. And their way, their version of what Judaism is about is much more lax in many ways. And he perceives it as danger. And what happens then? The two sides eventually develop separately in the north and the south of the country. They forget conveniently to tell us the story how they would eventually send us letters to the Persians claiming that this project should be put on hold. This is not mentioned here. Everybody wants to mention things that are convenient. At the same time, I'd like to mention that obviously history, as we know of it today, usually history is written by the winners. And we are clearly the winners of the story. We are the majority. We are the mainstream. Christians also adopt our version because they read the Book of Kings and they read our books. Samaritan version up until now wasn't even that much known. But now there's a new interest in that whole story and what happened there. And now we can ask ourselves a question: is it possible that a type of Jewish practice or Israelite practice in the Northern Kingdom that we never had a record of? Read the story of kingdom from the perspective of the south, from the perspective of Jerusalem. And it's very critical. Do we have their own destiny? One of theirs. Therefore, said Joseph read. And apparently that will going to bring the peace. In an original Israelite tradition will grace the world. In other words, if you ask the question, who are Samaritans, they're going to tell you we are the real Israelites. Now, of course, they also make a mistake, Samaritans to be not a sect. Or mainstream Judaism, they say we're not a sect. Very, and their way of life is centered around the understanding and the interpretation of the Torah. They didn't change any of that. They didn't change the calendar. They didn't make any adaptations or changes. They didn't make the script. So what's the punchline here? I think this is one of those myths that eventually, if we come to it, simply quite clear that we don't have any hostilities between us and Samaritans. One of the reasons that Samaritans are so small in number, they don't have any threat to Judaism. There's no threat coming from Samaritans. Is it possible that Samaritans will reveal certain aspects of our tradition that we need today and will help us to better understand who we are? I think yes. I think that's quite possible. So I think this could be not just some sort of historical, very useful and practical way of enlarging and enriching our own tradition. I think they can definitely contribute in this respect. The scholars today, I happen to have one friend on Facebook from that community. I wrote to him that I'm a tour guide in Israel, I'm very much interested in the heritage, I'm fascinated. He accepted, he befriended me, he wrote back conversations. I didn't ask him before preparing this presentation because I didn't want to sound like I'm too pro-Samaritan. He would have probably loaded me with information. But I will, please God, get in touch with him after this lecture. Find out what else they have to say.
Is he descendant or no?
Now they actually happen to be, you go on that website.
I went to them.
You've been to that village? Or you've been to?
Holland.
Oh, you've been to Holland.
We had a group trip to the Samaritans.
Very nice. How was it? Just part of my tour, of course.
Not the village, but it is different. And the ladies might not like their way of handling is that the woman cannot even whatever call it. They cannot even touch their children. So that they're set like for 2 weeks out.
Right. During the Nida period, yeah, it's very, very strict. Like it used to be in the Tanakh times. Yeah.
I mean, to the point where
Also, when it comes to their worship, when it comes to their prayer, women are never taking part in it. It's all men.
which is fine. This is like
In that sense, it's definitely like it used to be. And I would say almost like frozen in time in some aspects, which is interesting.
I just read something very interesting. Why did you allow to touch and why
Close that,
consider that
no.
really-
Someone which is the recording.
that the
You sure?
woman and the
When you
man
saw it, like,
were
so you
going
know.
together. It's like when Hashem
No.
brings